Today, we're exploring what it actually means to be truly invulnerable. As a society, we have this deep-seated fascination with armor, with physical toughness, and with building this impenetrable shell between ourselves and the rest of the world. But as we're about to see, our modern fantasies of survival, they might just have everything completely backwards. We're going to start our journey somewhere totally unexpected, and by the end, I promise you, we are going to completely redefine what human strength really looks like.
Okay, let's dive right into this by looking at the ultimate modern fantasy of invulnerability. I'm talking about the Marauder. Now, if you have Rolls-Royce Phantom money, we're talking around 300,000 pounds, and you can somehow pass a background check to prove you aren't a supervillain living in a hollowed-out volcano, you can actually buy this civilian military vehicle. On one hand, you have your standard, everyday, vulnerable commuter car, and on the other, you have the Marauder. It's literally a 10-ton beast that makes you the undisputed king of city traffic. Are you worried about getting blocked in at the supermarket? Yeah, don't be. Because with low-range four-wheel drive and diff locks, you can essentially just climb over whatever is in your way. And if a tow truck tries to haul you off, well, with an absolutely astonishing 1,100 Newton-meters of torque, you just throw it in reverse and completely win that tow-away tug-of-war.
But this intense obsession with building a personal fortress, it comes with some incredibly absurd realities. Imagine, for a second, pulling up to a drive-thru in this 10-ton behemoth just to grab a cheeseburger and chips. Step 1, you arrive. Step 2, you lean over to order. But Step 3 is where the fantasy hits a literal brick wall. You see, the windows on the Marauder are 90 millimeters thick. They are specifically designed to shrug off a rocket-propelled grenade. And because of that, they don't roll down. You literally cannot secure your lunch because your armor is just too thick to let the world in.
But wait, it actually gets even more extreme. 7. That's the number of pounds of C4 plastic explosive that was used in a direct test against a fully armored Hummer. 7 pounds of C4 absolutely decimated that Hummer. I mean, it left it completely dead with major pieces missing. But what happens when you put that exact same amount of explosives underneath the Marauder? Well, there's essentially a fistfight between the vehicle and the Earth loses. The explosives just blow a massive hole in the ground, and the Marauder simply drives away. It is, without a doubt, the absolute pinnacle of physical invulnerability.
Which brings us to the absolutely core question of this entire explainer. Is physical armor really how we survived as a species? I mean, we build these massive 10-ton trucks to feel safe today, but our ancient ancestors, they didn't have 90mm ballistic glass, and they definitely didn't have 1,100 Newton-meters of torque. They were incredibly soft and incredibly vulnerable. So if we drop this modern mechanical fantasy of toughness for just a second, how did a fragile species like ours actually make it through the harshest, most brutal conditions in history?
Section 1. The oldest human instinct, survival of the fittest?
To understand our actual survival, we need to look deep inside a cave in Iraq. It was there that researchers found a 46,000-year-old skeleton of a man who managed to survive for years with profound, debilitating physical disabilities. He had a withered arm, a missing hand, and was blind in one eye. By every strict textbook rule of survival in the wild, he couldn't hunt, he couldn't gather, and he absolutely couldn't defend himself. He should have been dead. But he wasn't, because his community made the active choice to feed him, protect him, and keep him alive.
And this discovery completely shatters this broken myth of brutal efficiency. You know the one, the idea that the strong live and the weak simply disappear. For the longest time, we just assumed that anyone who couldn't physically contribute was left behind to die. But the archaeological evidence just keeps proving that assumption wrong. We see the exact same thing with a 100,000-year-old skeleton of a Moroccan woman who had severe cognitive impairment. She lived well into adulthood. She simply couldn't have survived alone, which proves that her early human community chose to care for her. Not just for a passing season, but for years.
But, physical disability is one thing. What about the fractured mind? Consider this mathematical constant, 1%. 1% is the exact rate of schizophrenia across every human population, every culture, and every century ever studied. Mental illness didn't just suddenly arrive with smartphones or the overwhelming stress of the modern world. No, it is written directly into the very architecture of the human brain.
Section 2. Madness, Shamans, and Spirits, Chosen by the Unseen.
Picture an ancient band of about 50 humans sitting around a campfire. Based on that 1% math, one of them was likely experiencing a reality that absolutely no one else could see, hearing voices or seeing visions that just weren't there.
But ancient cultures didn't view these cognitive disconnects as a malfunction. In fact, the psychological profile of the ancient shaman heavily overlaps with what we diagnose today as clinical psychosis. Back in the ancient world, a person experiencing these profoundly altered states wasn't abandoned. They were seen as someone the spirits had hand-picked. They were the ones who could travel between worlds and communicate with forces the rest of the tribe just couldn't access. What we now call a symptom, they saw as a gift.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. When researchers looked at people experiencing clinical psychosis across different cultures today, a massive contrast emerged. People in Ghana and Vietnam often reported hearing voices that were familiar, ancestral, and sometimes even genuinely helpful. They had a cultural framework that gave the entire experience meaning. But over in the United States, those voices were almost universally experienced as hostile, threatening, and meaningless. It is the exact same illness inside the exact same human brain, but the story a culture tells about madness literally shapes what the illness feels like from the inside out.
Section 3. The medical versus supernatural. Shifting understanding.
Now, as humanity progressed, it wasn't always a gentle, enlightened transition. Some ancient cultures genuinely believed madness was demonic possession, and that led to some incredibly brutal rituals, like trepanation, where literal holes were drilled straight through a living person's skull to release evil spirits. I know, it sounds horrific, but here is the incredible part. We routinely find 10,000-year-old skulls that actually show healed bone regrowth around those drilled holes. Even in the midst of these agonizing, primitive rituals, the healed bones prove that someone stayed. Someone patiently nursed the patient. Someone kept them warm and cared for them during a truly horrific recovery.
As this deeply rooted care evolved into actual medical science, we hit some massive historical milestones. By 1550 BCE, the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus was already prescribing physical remedies in structured conversation, which is basically what we'd recognize today as early therapy. In the 5th century BCE, the Greek physician Hippocrates made the radical claim that mental illness was a medical problem of the brain, not a demonic possession. And in 705 CE, way before modern tools even existed, visionaries in the Islamic world like Al-Razi opened the first dedicated psychiatric hospital in Baghdad. They treated mental illness as a condition requiring trained physicians, rather than priests.
Section 4. Care, control, and cruelty. A complicated history.
Now, our track record of treating the vulnerable isn't just a clean upward arc from darkness into light. You can see this ancient tension formalized perfectly in ancient Rome. On one hand, Rome built the valetudinarium, these dedicated, profoundly compassionate spaces meant for healing and care. But on the exact same hand, Roman law introduced incredibly complex provisions for legal incapacity and guardianship. It firmly established the idea that some people needed to be managed, contained, and heavily controlled. That push and pull, that tension between compassion and containment is as old as civilization itself, and frankly, we're still navigating it today. During the Middle Ages, the pendulum swung violently backward toward cruelty. Those early medical frameworks were replaced all over again by the supernatural. In 1547, the Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, which is actually where we get the word Bedlam, did something unthinkable. They charged admission to the public. Everyday people actually paid money to go and watch the suffering of the mentally ill as a public spectacle. Just as entertainment, madness was once again viewed as possession, meaning isolation, starvation, and beatings were totally justified under the guise of driving out spirits.
It honestly took centuries for reformers to push back against this institutionalized cruelty. Figures like Philippe Pinel in France, Dorothea Dix in America, and William Tuke in England, they looked at the staggering suffering and they simply refused to look away. They wouldn't accept it. They argued that the mentally ill were not public spectacles, and they certainly weren't dangerous cargo to just be warehoused. What they essentially demanded was a return to the exact same compassion that an ancient, primitive community in Iraq had naturally shown to a disabled man 46,000 years prior.
Section 5. What makes us survive? True human strength.
When we pull all of this history together, one undeniable core truth just rises to the top. The decision that a suffering person is still a person worth staying for. This deep, profound impulse to care, it is the absolute oldest human instinct we have evidence for. Long before we had art, long before we had formal burial rites, and way before we had organized religion, there was a person who couldn't function alone and a community that decided to feed them and protect them anyway.
Which brings us right back to our final question. We kicked off this explainer looking at a 10-ton marauder, specifically designed to make us physically invulnerable to the outside world. But knowing what we know now about the actual reality of human history, what is true strength?
Are we really safer locked away behind 90 millimeters of RPG-proof ballistic glass, where we can't even connect with the world around us? Or is true survival actually found by being embedded within a community that simply refuses to let us fall? The archaeological record is pretty clear on this one. Our survival was never about the armor we built. It was always about the people who chose to stay.